those issues, any of them. Dmitry Babich, at the beginning of this program, we all agreed that on May 9th, 1945, there was more or less a universal understanding of what that defeat and victory for the Soviet Union and its allies meant. But then there's another really important historical event, and that is the end of the Cold War. As Jeffrey Roberts pointed out, it took us 15 years to understand we were in the Cold War, and we called it the Cold War. But then in the early 1990s, it all came apart, including the Soviet Union. And to this day, the attitude in Russia is that the Russian side didn't lose the Cold War, it opted out of it. However, in the West, it's a very different narrative.
Well, yes. A friend of mine, a journalist, used a very good metaphor for it. He said, we went out of the trenches of the Cold War. We didn't put our hands up. We went out thinking that, you know, on the other side, we have friends who also stayed in the trenches for some stupid reason. So we expected it to be like, you know, fraternization of French and Germans in the end of the
Western
First World War.
Yeah.
But it turned out that the West interpreted it as its victory and our defeat. And we didn't hear it. If you look at the speeches of Reagan, George Bush, the senior, there was none of it in the early 90s. They never said that we won the Cold War. So Russians expected that this was just a huge misunderstanding which is coming to an end. And there was no insistence on Gorbachev's side to formalize it. So the Cold War, unlike the World War II, was not properly ended. There was no agreement that would say, okay, here are the borders, here is what you can do, here is what later.
But it's because of this lack of understanding on all sides of what the end of the Cold War is all about, is that it really motivates maybe a lot, I would say, a lot of Western policymakers in particularly Washington, is that their perception is that Russia is a defeated country, and defeated countries are treated in a certain way, and defeated countries must behave in a certain way, and this is where the disconnect is. Jeffrey Roberts.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. There's a widespread perception in the West that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and its successor state, main successor state, Russia, was a defeated country. And of course, in the 1990s, Russia was very weak because of its internal problems and so on. And so there was a kind of perception that, you know, what you might call the Russian problem had been solved by Russia's weakness, but that wasn't the case. You know, Russia has risen again. So, you know, there is now, you know, the Russian question is back on the agenda, and the Russian question, you know, is the question of, you know, how is Russia to be integrated into Europe? What is the relationship going to between?
I think the train left the station. I think the train left the station because I think that was when maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago, where that integration, because it was what the Kremlin wanted that.
No, I
think now there's fewer and fewer people in the Kremlin that really want that.
If you want to see that, if you want to think that the train has left the station, if that's what the perception you want to hold, then maybe that becomes the truth. It only becomes true if we believe that to be the case. I don't think the train has left the station.
I agree. I think if there is a minimum amount of goodwill from the West, Russia
what's that
would
mean,
allow.
Dave? Can you give me an example of what that is?
This is the problem. Even a coming of Western leaders to Russia on May 9th, which is
wow, what a gesture. What does it cost them to do that?
So we have opportunities lost again and again. And one of these opportunities, I'm afraid, is going to be lost tomorrow.
Jeffrey.
The first thing, I think you can see that George Bush, the father, and Secretary Gorbachev had very good relations, as did Reagan with Secretary Gorbachev. And there was a generational aspect that both generations had gone through the Second World War. When George Bush Sr. left office, in came Bill Clinton, who had not served in the armed forces, obviously, and certainly was too young for the Second World War. And then you just see the problem arising with the expansion of NATO that began under his watch, and to which Yeltsin and the people here objected strenuously, but they were ignored. So this has been the line they've taken, that NATO should always be naturally expanding closer and closer, or right up to Russia's border, which was entirely not the agreement that Gorbachev and James Baker made when they were deciding on the unification of Germany.
A thing that needs to be done, the most important step forward that we can take, is to actually try and build some, mutual understanding. The West has to understand the Russian perspective, and the Russians have to understand the Western perspective, and that's the basis on which.
These are very smart men on this program, and they're absolutely right. But I don't see politicians being that smart, because we wouldn't be in this mess right now if we had people that have that kind of wisdom.
They were that smart during the Second World War. They were smart enough during the Second World War to ally with each other, despite different interests, different perspectives, to actually, one of the most important features of, the cooperation during the Second World War was mutual understanding, was the ability to see different perspectives on the basis of those.
Yeah, but they had a common goal, and we don't have one today.
But there are many common goals.
I agree with Jeffrey completely, but I would add that it's not just Russia that is against NATO expansion, and it's not just Russia that is damaged by it. But look at the society in Poland, in Ukraine. These are now badly divided countries, not only Ukraine.
Okay,
and they
David,
sometimes forget.
I really wish you'd brought this, but we've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT.